I'm going to bring up two good friends, Jonah Goodhart. He's the CEO and co-founder of Moat, a company that many of the publishers in this room works with. And Keith Grossman. He's publisher of Bloomberg Digital and Digital Products, Bloomberg Media Group. George, I don't know if you want to stick around. We're going to have a discussion up here. You might have to jump. We'll just...
I don't have to jump. I'll be here.
Okay.
George, thanks for really getting the room riled up there.
All right, so listen, a year or so ago, there were some pretty scary stats coming from Google, the ANA, and others saying that less than half of the ads on the internet were viewable. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, so that's a pretty big deal. Jonah, you're in the middle of a stream, massive stream of data. Where are we with those numbers? Are you seeing improvements in percent of viewability?
Yeah, we're seeing a little bit. First of all, thank you for having me here, and to the MPA for having me here.
Thank you.
We're seeing improvements. We're seeing the numbers go up a bit. I think our most recent quarterly benchmarks for display were 53% viewable, 52%, something like that. Video, something in the same ballpark, and that's up from a couple percentage points. What we're seeing is that certain publishers who are really focused on it are seeing big lifts, are going from an average number to 70%, 75%, 80% in some cases. So we're seeing improvements, but it's essentially for people that are focusing on it, and we're increasingly seeing more people focus on it. But surprisingly, I mean, George talks about this having been something that's been talked about now for 4 years and has been pretty foreshadowed. This is coming, this is happening, this is out there. There's still a significant part of the market that hasn't done much about it and has felt like, well, I'll deal with it when it comes to me.
Right. So this is what everyone wants to know. What is so difficult about the implementation then? Keith, maybe you could shed some light.
Sure. So, I mean, to George's point and Jonah's point, everyone likes to talk about change. Very few people like it when they have to actually enact change, and very few people want to actually change, right? Especially when it comes to viewability. One of the areas that makes it challenging is that every site has a different consumer, and every consumer looks at every page differently. And speaking from what I learned when I looked at Bloomberg versus Wired or Ars Technica, where I came from, every section of every one of those pages has a completely unique experience. So markets page, for instance, where the person will look for quotes, the consumer never scrolls down, right? So if you lazy load an ad below the page, then all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation where it doesn't make a difference because the consumer's never going to scroll to that level. Whereas on the home page, the consumer might go 4 or 5 frames down. So the more valuable spot is not necessarily at the top where you might think it would be. It's actually right at the folds where, I think Tony Hale over at Chartbeat did a really nice piece where he said, that is a hugely engaged editorial content arena for many homepages. And so I think that what you realize is that viewability is a very unique and personal sort of thing that you have to figure out. But there are ways and definite sort of, I don't want to call them tricks, but fundamental ways of looking at data provided by services like Moat that you can all of a sudden realize this position works on a page, this position doesn't.
So as a publisher, and as the guy that's helping these publishers illustrate their inventory quality, how are you positioning yourselves in terms of viewability? Do you go out, are you able to make guarantees, even programmatically, in terms of viewability?
So I tell the staff, and I'm blunt about this, that I think that it's actually like a comical position to oppose viewability. It's sort of like opposing oxygen. And I don't really understand the people who can look someone else in the eye and say this is ridiculous, your ad should not be seen. I do think that the reality is right. I do think that the reality is that change occurs unevenly within the industry, right? And so I'm in a very fortunate position where, in my current role, I literally rebuilt a website in a new world, right, with Bloomberg Business. But there are a lot of people who are not fortunate like that. They have to evolve their existing product. And I think that what we find is that there are a lot of tools out there. I mean, you saw all of the measurement tools that were listed by George a second ago. And there's not a lot of consistency. And when you look at the reconciliation numbers, reconciliation between two different services might be very, very different depending on the same ad. And I think that the reality that there's going to be this transition period is where the conversation has to really take place, which is why you more or less have the conversation. But what I've found is that any conversation that anyone's ever gone in where they've said to an agency partner or a client partner, we will not guarantee viewability, is a terrible position. And I think that in any instance where you have a rational sort of path towards understanding what the goals are and where you want to bring it, everyone sort of gets on the same page and understands, okay, we're going to measure this way, we're going to look at it this way, and we'll come to consensus.
Yeah. You mentioned, that reconciliation. George, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the MRC and the IAB have recommended, so given these limits of the current technology, that 70% of a digital ad campaign's measured ads should be viewable, with viewability defined as at least half the ad in view for 1 second or more. And when campaigns fall below that threshold, publishers are advised, at least for this transition year of 2015, to supply additional inventory to buyers in order to make up the difference. Jonah, from where you sit in the midst of all the data, is 70% a meaningful cutoff point?
Yeah, I think George might want to clarify.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
That 70% did not come from MRC.
So is that an IAB?
Strictly an IAB recommendation.
Okay, let's take MRC off of that claim. It's an IAB recommendation. But from a branding perspective, is 70%, does it seem like that is a workable
I mean, I think the idea, as I understand it from the IAB, was this is a tough transition.
Yep.
We weren't set up for this. The sites weren't designed this way. The design teams and the sales teams didn't sort of go figure this out together and come up with a better solution. Some of them are starting to do that now. But we need as they called it, transition period to get to a fully transacting on a viewable standard. And so I think their theory was, well, if we can at least sort of contractually guarantee that the in-view rate is 70%, then there shouldn't be a make good needed, et cetera. I think the reality is that some advertisers and agencies have said, okay, we're good with that. And others have said, why do I have to pay for that sort of 30% difference? And from my vantage point, I think this is something that we feel strongly about in the market, is that we believe that our role is to simply measure what both sides want us to measure, to provide reporting and data and analytics. We don't believe that we're in the sort of judge and jury business, and I think frankly it's different from how others look at the world. And so I think what I always tell people is, listen, if somebody wants to define a metric as anything that they can think of, somebody squinting at the screen while they whatever, great. If they want to transact on it, great. There's two sides to that. Somebody has to pay for it. There's a price. There's a market. And from our perspective, we'll measure it. We'll measure anything that people want us to measure. So I think the 70% thing, if in my non-Moat personal opinion, is it reasonable? Yeah, I think it's reasonable for sure. As an advertiser, do I want to knowingly be told that I'm buying ads that are not there? Not really. And so I would probably think it was less reasonable if I was the buyer.
No, I agree with that. I think that from the publishing side, what the 70% really does is it allows us to really understand how do we manage our yield, and how do we understand what is the level at which when we sit down at the table, there's no negotiation. We have to literally say we are not changing a CPM, or we are not looking at a VCPM of some level. And then above of which, then you start looking at supply and demand of what your inventory is, and you start saying, hey, well, look, we are more challenged to deliver this, but we can and we will. If we're going to guarantee certain levels on the ads, then we need to just know that you feel comfortable at a VCPM of this level. And it's been when you position and understand it like that, it's a very rational thing. I think if we're still stuck at 70% going into 2016, I think that it's actually a misfortunate thing or an unfortunate thing for the industry.
So you mentioned that yield and that pricing challenge. Keith, are you making different availability guarantees based on the different type of inventory? So mobile is still an open issue to standardize, but we've got video and we've got display. Are you shifting avails based on that?
I mean, we're delivering upon each each campaign based on whatever the bespoke needs are of those campaigns. The only rule that I have specifically sort of mandated when it comes to viewability is that you cannot oppose it. So you have to sort of lean into it, and you have to figure out a solution that works for each partner.
Yep. So, Jonah, you've spoken about viewability as being part of a larger shift in the market towards attention, right? And moving away from a click-based, world of performance media. How do you see branding and engagement that George mentioned, future looking, evolving in digital media? Are we getting closer to digital GRPs?
Yeah, I mean, so I think a digital GRP is going to be part of the future. I would say this. Today, where we sit, 2015, 90% of all retail is still bought offline, 90%. And that 90% of retail makes up the majority of brand advertising dollars in the world. And so the sort of fact is that there's not a direct response action for most of the biggest brands that buy advertising. And so the situation we find ourselves in is that there's not a real-time signal today that a brand can say, when I do this, I know that I'm getting cases of Coca-Cola sold off the shelf, I'm getting soap sold by Unilever, I'm getting so on and so forth by every major brand out there. And so I think that there's a desire to have something better. And I think there's been, over the last, unfortunately, 20 years it took us to realize that clicks are not a real good signal for a brand, because 3 in 10,000 do it, and it happens to not be most of your customers. And so the conclusion has been, well, we need something better then. And I think the thing with viewability that George touched on it, which is that viewability is not a performance metric, it is not a KPI, it is not your indicator that you're going to sell more products necessarily. It just literally means that your ad was there and possible to be seen. And so as compared to your ad not being there, yes, you will sell more products than having your ad not have been there. But once we get to a place where the assumption, the presumption, the table stakes is that the ad was there and it was a human being, the discussion is not about viewability anymore. The discussion is about creative. The discussion is about how do you emotionally engage a consumer? How do you tell a story? How do you create an environment where somebody goes, you know what, I'm going to go with that product because I like them, I trust them, it makes me feel good about whatever the thing is that they're doing. And so I think when you think about metrics, how do you get to a place where you can measure something beyond simply the ad being there? I think you start coming up with ideas, and the most obvious one to us is to look at things like time and space. How much of the screen was in front of the person? For how long? What did they do? Was there any action that we can measure? If you were to look at a physical store, if you were to go to the Apple store on Fifth Avenue and you were to watch the number of people that walk in and what they do when they walk in, you'd notice that some people walk in for 3 seconds, some people spend 30 minutes. Some people pick up products and walk around and look at the back, some people don't. Some people talk to the person there, some people don't. You'd see all different attentive and less attentive behaviors from people as they experience a store. I think the exact same thing happens in the digital world, and that's sort of what we think is the next phase of this. So long way of saying I think this is about attention, and I think it has to be about something beyond viewability.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Someone asked me the other day, when will we know that this viewability discussion is successful? And my answer was, when you stop talking to me about it. And the reality is like the easiest way to give an analogy to it is thinking about your phone bill, right? Like, I pay my phone bill once a month, right? And I don't think about it for the entire month unless there's a problem. And viewability should be one of those things where, like, your RFP comes, you check off that you can deliver on it, and you move forward, and you focus on what's the true sort of measurement that matters for that campaign. For me, right, I look at attention as something that's very appealing, and I think attention is a place where a lot of people are going to play, because in the grand game of scale, Facebook and Google, they are going to crush us every time in the premium publisher place. But where I'll always win is on engagement and on time spent and on some of the other aspects that they can't compete on. So, for me, I look at the attention economy sort of as a really interesting place to go.
Right. I want to open it up to questions, because this is certainly a hot button for anyone that's in the business of creating content, creating ad products. George, is there anything you wanted to add to this?
No, I thought that was very, very well done.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Can I ask, so if we're using a vendor think the discussion is going on in terms of what's fair? Is it, I've been to one conference, someone said 20%, I've heard 10%. Like, what is kind of the general consensus now?
Does everyone hear that? The question is, if you've got a couple of different viewability vendors, what's a reasonable discrepancy percent to manage in the context of a campaign?
I mean, my view on the discrepancy thing is that it comes down to transparency. And so if you have fully transparent device level, browser level, measurability and viewability and humanity and everything sort of broken out with sunshine, then the discrepancy issue is not that big of an issue because it's really obvious where there was a difference between the companies. If everything was 100% transparent and everybody had 100% measurability and all of that was the same and there was a discrepancy beyond that, I think the same rule that we've applied historically to ad serving, roughly 10% being sort of within the realm of reasonability, makes sense. But the issue that I have and why we talk a lot about this in market is that I think people aren't transparent. And so I think people present a report in the end of the day that says viewability was X. And you really got to dig to figure out that, well, what they're really saying is that for this portion of the campaign that was actually measurable on these browsers, viewability was X. But on the other browsers and on the other parts of the campaign, they actually didn't even measure it. So they're not making a statement about that, but it looks like they are. And so it looks like there's a huge difference between the two numbers. When, on George's point, when you take all of the companies and put them in a vacuum and you sort of test them head to head, they all do what they're supposed to do by and large, at least the major ones do. The issue, I think, is that the ad tech ecosystem is complex, and so we're left in a place where you can be on a campaign where Moat measures it and has a measurability score of X, somebody else has Y, and those are totally different. And I think we're not being transparent today. So my view, and I've said this a lot publicly, is that I think we need to mandate transparency around all of these things in every report if there is going to be two different vendors on a campaign.
And probably, if possible, sync up on the campaign vendor at the get-go, so you're not having the
I
conversation.
mean, that was part of the IAB recommendation, was to choose one company before the campaign that both sides agree on.
Well, thanks. Jonah from Moat and Keith from Bloomberg, thanks very much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.